Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to share this project with you. My name is Stephanie Pan. I am a freelance artist working mainly actually in sound. So I'm a composer and a voice artist, performance artist, interdisciplinary maker, and textile artist. And together with my duo partner, Stelios Manusakis, I co-founded and artistic co-direct Stichting Modules, or in English, Modulus Foundation, which is an artist-run production house. And we operate at the intersection of art and technology research. We really work in a way sort of beyond discipline. We're really interested in sort of answering or asking big questions and using whatever tools are necessary for that. And today I'd like to talk about algorithmic knitting design, which is a project I started in 2020, where I develop knittable or like knitwear patterns for hand knitters that integrate algorithmic computing into their designs. And to do that, I've been working with several people, with Stelios Manusakis, who's a composer, an interdisciplinary artist, a researcher, composer, software developer, Jan Truchle von Falkenstein, we're all, the three of us are based in The Hague, and computational architect Wei Hao Wang, who is based in between like Japan, Taiwan, and UK, and he's the founder of Sawara Architects. So the project, I started in 2020. There are currently 10 published patterns, and I try to publish about 3 to 4 patterns a year. And I sort of consider this like a new branch of my practice. In a past life, I did a bachelor's at UC Berkeley in with a double major in applied mathematics and music. So that's sort of been in my back pocket. Otherwise, I basically operate in the art sector. Through the project, I use algorithms to populate the surface, let's say, of knit wear, to create the textures. So this is like knit and purl in knitting, which are the two most basic stitches we have, or color work. Let me see, where's my color work? This one, which is a cowl. And what else do we have? Intarsia, which is another form of color work where you work in blocks of color. So this is Intarsia. So it's all being knit together in one piece rather than sort of knit separately and then sewn together afterwards. A new version of Marlisle, which I have developed for this pattern, which is about to come out, which, for knitters, it's a way of working color work where you can work back and forth because you carry the colors together instead of having to carry what is called floats. In the back, this is like a color work sock. This is what it looks like on the back side. You have to sort of negotiate the two colors at the same time. So with this project, I'm sort of looking to posit knitting and other handicrafts as a form of applied mathematics and applied science. And that mainly from the perspective of the knitter. So from the crafter themselves, what happens if we start to think of ourselves as scientists or mathematicians, and like how does that sort of jog the way we think about the craft? And it related to that, sort of taking a major step in updating the aesthetics and the sensibilities and the possibilities of hand knitting, like specifically knitwear made manually. And the third is to sort of democratize the notion of high art by publishing artistic blueprints. So I'm really, in a way, very uninterested in fabrication myself. I really like the idea of publishing patterns that people can access and can replicate themselves in whatever way or means they have possible. So once you have the blueprint, you decide what yarn you want to use, what needles, what colors you want, what materials you want, depending on what your aesthetics, possibilities, all of these things are. So Where's my, do I have some, I'm trying to, how do I do this? Yes, there. So this is one of the designs. So I was going to tell a little bit about the background, my personal background, about how I came to the project. So I am a crafter by nature. I've been sewing since I was in my teens and designing clothing. I was crocheting as a child. I'm an origamist. I've made shoes. So I'm really like creating things with my hands is really important to me. I came to knitting like fairly late in the way, in my 30s, once I'd sort of hit an aesthetic wall with crochet, where I just felt like it felt very outdated to me, and it was really hard for me to create anything that I didn't feel like reflected my aesthetics. And I started getting into knitting, but I was very struck at a certain point when I was trying to look for patterns that I could knit that sort of balanced my need for pretty complex knitting as an activity with what I actually wanted to wear. So when I had, you could have a very beautiful basic sweater, but I would just die of boredom because all you did was knit one stitch. And so I sort of found this very frustrating. And that was the sort of initial balance. And then eventually I started designing patterns for myself. And I would read these patterns to studies every once in a while, or patterns from other people, because I found they sounded like computer code to me. And so that sort of initial parallel that we sort of came across together really launched the idea for algorithmic design. So within the realm of knitting, there have been some projects that are sort of dealing with algorithms in knitwear design. We're right now particularly focused in cellular automata, because it translates pretty inherently to certain techniques in knitting. There's Fabienne Serrière, or Knityak, who was working with cellular automata. Locally here in the Netherlands, there's Sebastian Cox, also known as Monobrow, who fabricates glitchware. And in all of these cases, it's all fully fabricated. There are some experiments in the last 25 years that I know of in hand knitting patterns. Debbie New was possibly the first designer to use a cellular automata. Nora Gon, who's a pretty famous designer, has done one pattern that I know of. And Lana Holden has done some things, but it's been pretty thinly spread over the years. So I wanted to really sort of try and expand the challenges that we are willing to take on as crafters through this project. So I wanted to share with you a little bit the process of how we do that at Algorithmic Knitting Design. It's been through a couple different iterations at this point. The first thing I do is really think about design. And in that respect, I'm really inspired by Japanese and Belgian minimalism. So I'm really interested in form and shape and drape. So how shapes fall onto bodies, less than actual, like, more traditional construction of top-down sweaters or raglan sleeves, these sort of traditional constructions of knitwear. And then I really love the glitch of, or the chaotic nature of digital aesthetics. So I wanted to sort of bring these things together, and that's sort of the aesthetics of how I design. So the first thing I do is decide what the object is going to be and what the construction is. So this is the schematics for Soliton's sweater, which is the first sweater that I designed. And on the left, you see how it's constructed. So it's knit starting from the bottom horizontally, and it's effectively knit on the bias. So it's sort of tilted 45 degrees, and once the whole thing is knit, and the neckline is sort of knit in as you go along. So it's knit as a single piece, turned 45 degrees, and then attached diagonally at the bottom. So that is the world, let's say. And then what happens there is after that I decide on the yarn and the needle size, and I knit a swatch to determine the gauge. And that is sort of how we calibrate in knitting. So it's a way to sort of know that we're all sort of speaking the same language. And if we're not, if someone's gauge is different from my gauge from a pattern, how they can adjust the pattern in order to still replicate design more or less. So that happens. And once we've got that, then I would go into what is now the Knitting Factory app. So if this started with Stelios, it was based on where is it now? Mircea Wojciech's Cellular Automata Simulator, MCell, was replaced very quickly after that by Stelios's interpretation of that or implementation of that in Super Collider. And that has since been ported to an app by Jan called Knitting Factory. So we could maybe look at that very quickly. The video. So this is where we're sort of at. This sort of now allows me to design a bit more autonomously, so I don't have to sit Stelios down every single time. And it's based off the workflow we sort of developed. So once I have determined the gauge, I know how many stitches and how many rows I need to create the piece of fabric I need to knit. And then I input that into the app. So the width would be how many stitches I want. The height is how many rows I want. And then you can go in and populate which cellular automata you want to use. And we like to leave a little bit of a chance in it. So you can determine the initial seed. So how many ones there are. And sort of randomly placed, and then a range of the minimum and maximum rows that something can happen, whether the selection of cellular automata is randomized or if you want it in a specific order. So it has a lot of possibilities for playing with. After that, we like run the software a bunch of times and save, I don't know, like it's starting to get up to like upwards of like 40 outputs that I can then play with and spend some time with and determine how I can interpret them. So we output a PNG file that has exactly the number of cells, let's say. So every pixel equals one stitch. And I take that PNG and I drop it into a web-based app called Stitch Fiddle, which has been developed for knitters, which can translate images into charts. So I use that like black and white PNG from Knitting Factory to drop it in Stitch Fiddle, match gauge basically, and then start working with it. So for things like Knit and Purl and Fair Isle color work, it's sort of one-to-one. It's pretty easy to deal with. I think we can stop there. Yeah, let me see where we're at here. If I go back to the slide. And sort of translate it. So this is the Soliton sweater again. So the image before was the PNG of a single cellular automata that I used for that first design. And this is sort of how it gets translated into Knit and Purl with some shaping in the corners to create the waistline and the wrists, the cuff. And this is what the object becomes. So in order to then translate from that place to this, I knit a sample, and this takes anywhere from 1 to 2 months, depending on what size the project is. And if that goes well, I write it up, size it, which can take quite some time, and then ask a bunch of test knitters who are effectively sort of beta testers who get advanced access to the pattern, and they give feedback on what their experience is. After that, we take photos and then publish the pattern online, and it becomes available for any knitter who wants it. They're sold on Ravelry or via the website. And so that was Solitons. This is another one I just wanted to talk a little bit about. So the project is not particularly dogmatic about sort of algorithmic purity. I'm really interested from a sort of aesthetic perspective. So I've started working more with combining different outputs where it suits me, interpreting them in ways that work better for knitting or for interest. So you'll see here on the left is the black and white are the two PNGs or two different outputs, which I basically combined. So the white areas are the places I basically took for this design. And in the second black and white model, you'll see that I also added some texture. For example, like I added some lace just to add some interest. So it wasn't just this sort of plain solid surface. And that's, the sort of outcome of it. Where am I at? Oh, yes. So some thoughts on the process. What's really interesting is how, looking at what cellular automata work well for different techniques. So things that are pretty chaotic can work really well for color work, because that's sort of the clearest way. Things like knit and purl designs, this one, are much subtler, let's say. So they don't sort of show patterns as clearly. So there are certain things that have lots of diagonal lines, things like this work better for knit and purls. And the system, the workflow starts to break down when we start to get into more complex knitting techniques that don't translate one-to-one. So I've been working with Weihao on cable textures. And so where the workflow really breaks down is in lace and cables. And they have sort of similar challenges. One being that the commands are just much greater in number, or like cables just don't. I haven't found a way to translate cellular automata and cabling. Like, it's just a totally different language in a way. Lace, you can almost do it, but the problem is that there's all this interdependency in commands. So like if you insert a hole in lace, basically you increase the number of stitches. So somewhere along that row, you have to decrease the number of stitches. So there's a sort of interdependency between commands that I haven't quite worked out a way to deal with yet. We're working with Stelios on L systems now as a sort of new step, but it still has sort of similar challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is that the charts that are output for lace and cable are very much not representative of what the output will be. So you can see here a little bit with the cable software that Weihao's been developing. The left is sort of a way of visualizing cables, and then having a sort of more closely related visual output on the right to be able to visually place cables, and how we can sort of work forward with that. Lace, both of them are just like the charts are generally very cryptic. So that's some of the challenges we're sort of looking at in the future, sort of working towards. I'm looking at eventually maybe doing a residency in TU Eindhoven with Christian Andersen, where they have a knitterate to look at things like prototyping, which is a very, very time-consuming process when you're totally focused on hand knitting. So yeah, I'm like running a little bit over time, so I think I'm going to stop now. But I just wanted to sort of conclude by saying I think what I'm really interested in is sort of offering this question of like, if we as knitters see ourselves as scientists and mathematicians, what does it do to the way we approach the craft? So that's it. This is all the collaborators in the group.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Always good to rely on Olympus and clapping. Lovely presentation. Great that you're going to visit Christina in her lovely lab in TU.
Yeah, she's great.
So there's a couple of questions popping up in the chat. Eliane as one that was going through my mind as well. Like, this is a hand knitting project, and if the hand knitters are following charts, then what's the experience like for them? Is it really difficult, or do they find themselves following the algorithm to some extent?
So I think it's really like we've developed some really cool hacks basically to like color coding charts. So if you add different colored stitch markers, like every 10 or 20 stitches, and then add a vertical line in the chart, because the charts are enormous. The charts can get to like 300 stitches in a row and 400 rows for the really large pieces. It works really well actually for keeping track of where you are. So like if you have, so we use stitch markers. I use stitch markers in a very different way. So I use stitch markers just to like markate places in charts where they're traditionally maybe a bit more used for repetitions or this kind of thing. So when you see you're coming up at red, so you only really have to keep count for like 20 stitches or 10 stitches, depending on how you want to mark them. I have gotten a little bit better about dealing with error myself. Like I'm pretty like, I want them to be right, but sometimes with these chaotic patterns, you're like, nobody's ever going to see this. So I just sort of let go of correcting everything. But and the other thing with rows is like I like printing out charts. I recommend that people print out the charts and sort of glue them together, and then I tend to use a highlighter to mark off knit rows, and I've gotten to the point where I can sort of mark off one every 10 rows or something, and I'm pretty good about keeping things. And I'm like I'm a good knitter, but I'm not. There are many knitters who are much better than me, so they do really well. They burn through these things sometimes, and I think that's really fun. That like just offering knitters new challenges that really lean into inherent capacities they already have. Like they're really capable of doing all of these things. So it's still like a little bit of a niche audience, let's say. I'll admit there's a lot of people who are more sort of TV knitters and don't want to do this stuff, but I know I'm not alone. There's like quite a few people who like having a fun challenge.
Cool. So Madeline says that they've been craving this sort of system for about a decade without knowing where to start, and just asks a question: is the Knitting Factory available for Android?
So it's not been like publicly deployed yet. We're still sort of testing things, and we're also sort of figuring out how that app is going to exist. You can, like, the thing is that you can actually play with Yoto Morimoto has made a port of the M-Cell from Wojciechowski. What's his last name? I always forget his last name. Wojciech. So those things are readily available, and that app is basically a version of those open source simulators. So the work of designing is still very manual. So all of the shaping and all of those things are not in that app yet. I don't know if they'll ever be, in a way. Like, I think that app was sort of developed for me to not have to get studies to sit down every time I wanted to make a design.
Okay. Right, so Amy has a question. Have you ever worked with existing traditional patterns and made adaptations from there? They're interesting questions of artistic appropriation when working with existing patterns, especially traditional ones. What's your take, or does it not matter?
I'm actually not focused on that at all, because I find the use in knitting tends to be very repetitive, and it's part of what I really don't that doesn't like appeal to me. I really love asymmetry and chaos, and it was one of my challenges. Like, I really love like a Fair Isle top yoke. If you're a knitter, like a Fair Isle top yoke, top down yoke sweater is very appealing as a knitting process. But I feel like a circus lion when I make one of these things, because it just sort of like these things that sort of repeat and frame. I really don't. It doesn't appeal to me. So I sort of have sort of eschewed the notion of traditional patterns, I think, just because they don't suit me aesthetically, let's say.
Fair. And Ariane has a follow-on suggesting the benefit of using algorithms in hand making is using the algorithms when hand making. I suppose something here about the agency of the knitter. So here it seems the design process comes before the knitting. Can you see ways in which that design process could be brought into the knitting itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I really want to, where my focus has been, is that I want knitters to be able to surprise themselves with these sort of chaotic patterns without having to know how to program. So just more really from a sort of crafting perspective of just being allowed to just like be told what to do and then and coming up with it. And knitters, I think crafters, like they really run the spectrum of like, I want to know exactly what I'm going to do. I want to know exactly what it's going to look like. So you have knitters who want to get a pattern. They want to get the exact same yarn, the exact same color, and they want to know what they're going to get. And other ones who are very open to just sort of changing things how they like and sort of loosely interpreting your pattern. But I think for me is really, like, personally, as someone who also like totally doesn't code, it's like always been a little bit too abstract for me, despite a sort of love for numbers. I kind of liked just having people be able to read charts and being able to reproduce something without having to worry about whether or not people are able to code or like interpret algorithms.
So I think we're coming near the end, unless there's a short question from one of the hubs in Barcelona, Linz.
Yeah. I have a short question, actually.
Okay.
Thanks. I was checking out your website, and I don't want to sound lazy, but I was wondering if one could buy the finished pieces anywhere.
We have just started that, so that's actually a really new. I actually announced it yesterday on my newsletter. It is possible. You'd have to get in touch. I have a professional knitter that I'm working with who can fabricate. That's something we want to try working now that it's total like it. There's a very limited number of orders, of course, at a time, but it's possible to have one prefabricated